1374 was eventful indeed, but only in 1375 did its events truly begin to bear fruit. The volcanic eruption in Iceland hurled so much smoke and ash into the air that the rest of the winter was extraordinarily bitter. But the gravity of things didn't really settle in until spring snows became common and the summer sun proved dim and distant. The disease outbreaks turned into epidemics across the northern hemisphere, thin harvests turned into crop failures, and navigable rivers and coastal routes turned into deadly hazards, choked with ice. Globally, this caused Scythian expansion eastward to entirely cease for a time, and the interethnic conflicts of the Moshir Kor Khanate grew more violent as the forest failed to give forth enough meat. But nowhere were the effects of the bitter years, as they came to be known, more notable than in the League of the Storm Cross. Indeed, the League had overcome a great many challenges, and the interoperability of their trade networks and military commands made them surprisingly resilient in the face of crisis. They had rebuffed foes both external and internal, having just put down the recent satanic revolt with all the vigor for which they were known. However, as they say, men are only a few missed meals away from barbarism, and the crop failures across the continent exposed weaknesses in how the League did business. Had the harvest been plentiful, as usual, and the harvests redistributed between member states in order to shore up those who may have had a lean year, the League had aims on their northern neighbors, the heathens who had only just recently fought as co-belligerents against satanic Pyria. But, with the sky dark and the month of June still dusting rooftops with snow, everything was put under stress, and these plans were put on hold. Nikitas III, Bishop of Rhodes, was of a mind to centralize authority in this time of crisis, wanting to take direct operational authority from the Supreme Inquester Militant in order to diversify the military orders during this time of peace into various civilian care roles, like medicine, charity, building repair, and so on. The Supreme Inquester Militant, a Lucanian man named Sethre Tarkna, meanwhile, opposed the proposal of the High Bishop, stating that such work was better left to his inquestors, who were educated men already embedded in civilian government across every member kingdom, and he instead requested greater direct tax support from the crowned heads of Christendom in order to support such an endeavor. Nikitas III, taken aback by this refusal, was nonetheless persuaded by the plan of the Supreme Inquester Militant. Indeed, it would save the Church a fair penny in times which were already lean, and also keep the military orders in a singular-minded state of combat readiness. Regardless, one of the military orders decided of their own accord to involve themselves in civilian welfare, this being the Order of Western Lightning. Adept in matters of construction, they took it upon their own expense to construct cold-weather shelters which were of common use for entire villages, which were then handed over to local churches to administer and upkeep. In any case, the order of the Supreme Inquester Militant went out, and taxes to support an inter-kingdom professional class of inquestors during this time of crisis began to be levied, this tax being called the Genikos. The Genikos was perceived by many crowned heads to be a stretch too far, even if they all supposedly benefited from it in the form of free professionals. On the one hand, they received pro bono aid from learned men in medicine, construction, and other trades, and also received harvests from elsewhere to pad out their own, while on the other hand, their own professionals fell into unemployment, and they already had trouble drumming up enough taxes to keep up during the bitter years as it was. Indeed, every single expense proved too much, especially when they had no say in the matter. All of this had now exposed a long-developing state of affairs. The League of the Storm Cross, since its founding a mere 62 years ago, was looking less like an alliance and more like a confederation, or, perhaps, even some kind of empire. The monarchs of Europe had, for decades now, given up ever greater shares of their own autonomy to the League in exchange for the ease of governance it afforded them, and the myriad benefits that came their way. Wars between members of the League were totally forbidden, so peace was enjoyed along miles and miles of border territories, and border checks transformed into country inns and village bureaucrats who could stamp your documents if you wanted a record or otherwise to send a letter. Trade was easy and wide-reaching, with soap from eastern Gothonia traded for lemons from southern Lucania, traded for wine from Santonia, traded for cured meats from Vasconia, and on and on. It was once inconceivable that royalty along the Mediterranean could enjoy ice in their drinks, but thanks to the robust and speedy trade network, such a luxury could even be enjoyed out of season, for a price. Even the military orders operated largely independently and could come to your aid whenever there was unrest at home, which in and of itself was quite rare. However, now, when the benefits were not quite as bountiful, the kings of the land noticed that their stations were no longer necessarily the highest in the land. They found men demonstrably above them, men who could tell them what to do. And now, the Supreme Inquisitor Militant was telling them what to do. At the moment, such control wasn't necessarily formalized, just that if you happened to not comply, then you'd find yourself exiled, and at the whims of normal geopolitical conditions once again. Indeed, in these last 62 years, many of the kings across the continent had never needed to rule outside of the context of the League, and some of them were born into a time when the League was already long established. Despite these conditions, though, many monarchs were content to wait out the storm under the auspices of the church administration, save for two particular areas. In the northeast, Gothonia, under Sigeric Ingodres, had maintained much of his own independence and loved his own power. He saw himself as a king and sought to remain as such. Sigeric exiled the Rhodian Inquisition from his lands, brought the Order of the North under his personal command, and notified the Bishop of Rhodes that he would not be paying the Genikos tax, instead employing his own men to care for his own people in their own time of need. Simultaneously, the king of Lucania, Kalas Arasna, proclaimed that his kingdom was not paying the Genikos either. Then, on the exact same day, King Sigeric launched an invasion eastward into Scythia in order to obtain prime farmland, while Lucania launched an invasion of Sicily, that fellow Christian trade kingdom whose only sin was that they did not want to join the League. Immediately, there was chaos in the upper echelons of the League, as in its 62-year history, not once did a member state carry out a nearby invasion on their own without the support of the rest of the League. And, with the Order of the North operating totally outside the command of the Supreme Inquisitor Militant, this state of affairs was very suddenly unstable. The Supreme Inquisitor Militant, Sethre Tarkna, rushed to organize against Gothonia primarily, seeing King Sigeric's co-opting of a military order from his authority to be an explicitly treasonous act. Meanwhile, Nikitas III, Bishop of Rhodes, rushed to prioritize the chastisement of Lucania for attacking the Christian kingdom, even if they weren't in the League, and accused the Supreme Inquisitor Militant of sparing Lucania his wrath because he himself was Lucanian. The two came into direct opposition with one another, and the ensuing debate meant very little got done, even the regular operations of the League, leaving King Sigeric and King Arasna free to conduct their wars with relative impunity. Indeed, an ecumenical council was even called, such was its importance, given that the offices of Supreme Inquisitor Militant and Bishop of Rhodes were both organs of the Church, and until now their power-sharing dynamics had been perhaps too ill-defined. The council was called the Council of Thessaly, and it was arranged in order to settle the issue at hand. One side held that the offices of Supreme Inquisitor Militant and Bishop of Rhodes existed as co-equal rulers of different realms, Supreme Inquisitor Militant being the arm of the Church meant for temporal affairs, like war, government, and administration, while the Bishop of Rhodes played a spiritual role. Meanwhile, the other side held that the Bishop of Rhodes existed as a kind of world emperor, an authority above all kings and offices, with both worldly and spiritual power. These two camps were called the Dicharists and the Henoarchs, respectively. In common parlance, they were called the Black Cloaks and the Red Cloaks. The Council of Thessaly would prove to last longer than anyone expected going in, but at least for now, the respective parties still primarily wished to maintain the integrity of the League as a whole. Meanwhile, as the glaciers advanced and the relations between members of the League became frigid, the heathens of the North saw an opportunity that might indeed be their best and only chance to preserve their way of life.